I had lost about 75 pounds, so I was sort of, I could feel what could happen, if this actually came true, if the dream really came true. And this friend of mine that I'd known years before showed up for a visit, and he and I were both sort of eating buddies, in those days we would go out for an ice cream sundae or something. We worked at the same place, and we were both obese, and he was still, a 300-pounder, and I'd gotten down to a real slim 225 or something like that, and so he looked at me. I remember I opened the door and he looked at me and he said, "God, what are you doing, and what happened to you?" And I tried to explain this thing that I was going through, and I remember the way he looked at me. And it's probably a lot, it's probably like a lot of people when they start some kind of a change process, the people that are in their lives sort of don't know how to relate to it. And so what he did, this was so bizarre, he went into town and he brought back a 5-pound box of chocolate caramels, which was like the ultimate bad food for me, during that time, and but it was like he walked in the door, and he was a practical joker. I mean, this was partly a practical joke, but I could see the sort of mean edge to it, of kind of wanting to sabotage and wanting to kind of get me to be the way I was. And I realized if I was going to have to, that I didn't have any way to relate to him. And so I basically had to throw him out of my house, leave, please leave. And he did. And what an amazing... 6 months later, I got a call from a friend of mine and said, "Are you sitting down?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Ken died. He had a heart attack and died." And he was 26 years old, which was, I mean, and I saw in that moment how that was me. So that was a wake-up moment for me, and a way of saying, life has very serious consequences, choices have very serious consequences. After that year, I moved to California for a few years and went to graduate school. And so over the next few years, I pretty much felt good all the time, and I could see well, and my weight stabilized and all of that. And I hadn't ever worked out the whole relationship aspect of life, and I continued to have kind of one relationship after the other of, they'd get to a certain point and then they would fall apart. I would usually start finding fault with the person, or the other person would find fault with me, and we'd never be able to work beyond a certain point with our relationship. And so one magic day, I remember setting the intention of, oh, I learned how to see, I learned how to be an okay weight, I learned how to live healthy, free of addictions, I learned how to eat well. How come it didn't occur to me that I could do that with loving? It had never occurred to me that I could actually design my own life around love and relationships. And so that was a big revelation to me, the idea that the same process could work. And so I began to work with this idea of enjoying a flow of love in my life, and that love comes to me. I don't have to pursue it. And as I began to work with that, I had this other amazing insight. In fact, I was walking down the street in San Francisco, I remember, in downtown San Francisco, with a woman that I'd been with for a year or so, and we always had the same complaint with each other. Her complaint about me was that I was not in touch with my feelings, and that I never communicated about anything important, that I never would talk about the real stuff, And I, of course, had my defenses against that, that I forget what they were, but I had my good justification for why I didn't talk about my feelings and didn't talk about things that were important. My complaint about her was that she was super critical. And so whenever she would get going with me about, we never talk about anything important, or you're never in touch with your feelings, I would say, well, I would be if you weren't so darn critical. And it would get us into this loop then. And I was walking down the street with her in San Francisco, and I realized, I don't know where this insight came from, but I suddenly realized that, oh, I create that. I'm the one that creates and has created my life so that I'm in relationship with a very critical person. And up until that moment, I thought it was their problem, that I just happened to have the bad luck of always ending up with a critical woman. And so I remember stopping on the street kind of to think about this, and she said, "What's going on?" And I was kind of trying to share this insight with her, and she wasn't having any part of it, by the way. She was not buying my little insight at all. And so the other awareness that I had in that moment was that the very thing that I complained about all the time, and this is true for everybody, I think, that the very thing we complain about over and over is the very thing that we're creating happening. In other words, we got this loop going of not realizing that we draw certain experiences into our life and then going around complaining about that all the time. So anything you complain about repetitively is something that you have an unconscious intention to produce. And so that hit me like a ton of bricks. I suddenly realized, oh, I require a critical woman in my life. That's me dreaming up that dream. And my next thought was, well, I think I'll dream up a better dream. You know, I'll dream up a dream of being surrounded by loving and supportive people. And that was really a big moment for me, because nobody in the history of my family that I know of has ever had a successful relationship besides me and Katie. In other words, up until that moment, my parents had a disastrous relationship. My grandparents, just about everybody, everywhere I looked in the family, was full of people who either they had a very kind of like a routine relationship, they went through the roles, certain roles, or they managed to stay in a long-term relationship through the regular application of vodka and other kinds of things that allowed them to stay put, you know. I realized that it would be breaking absolutely radical new ground if I was able to create a relationship that worked, that would be an unthinkable thing to do. And what better thing to make happen, you know, than something completely unthinkable. And so I sat down on the floor of my apartment at the time and designed what I wanted in a close relationship in my mind. And honesty, a relationship where both of us were free to pursue our creativity, our creative callings, and that each of us took full responsibility for our lives so that we didn't get into blaming each other. So if something came up, we would just say, why did I create that, you know? And so I remember saying to the universe at the time, that's what I want, and if it's not in the cards for me to have that, I'll be alone. I'm fine with being alone, but I promise I will never settle for less. And I think that little thing I said at the end kind of cracked the whip, you know. It said, that's what I'm about here. And so from that moment, it only took a month until Katie came into my life. And one of the great moments of my life was my first meeting with her, because she came up to me to ask me a question. I was actually giving a seminar at the graduate school where she was getting her PhD, and she was also one of the instructors there at the school. She was the movement therapy instructor and taught some of the classes there, and she was also getting her PhD. And so she came up to ask me a question during this seminar I was giving. I don't remember what the question is to this day, but I said to her, I'm very attracted to you. I just want to let you know that. And I said, but I also want to let you know that I'm only interested in relationships where both people speak honestly to each other, and both people take responsibility for their lives, and both people are committed to their creativity. And on those terms, would you like to have a cup of coffee with me? And it was kind of a, I mean, I'd never said anything like that in my life. You know, it was a totally outrageous thing to say, especially given the context of what was going on. And so I remember the look on her face. She kind of went like this. You know, it's like cogitate, cogitate, compute, compute, does not compute. And suddenly she said, okay. And I can do that. And so, you know, that was our first meeting and basically set the tone for our whole last 27 years together.